Origin Series. Part 1, Sumer, the First Cities. Chapters 1 to 8. Circa 3500 to 2300 BC. Introduction. Welcome to the Origin Series. This series tells the story of the ancient world before the events covered in the World Empires series, before Babylon, before Assyria, before the kings of Judah. This is the deeper past, the world that invented cities, writing, law, and literature. The world that made everything else possible. We begin in Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now southern Iraq. And we begin at the very beginning, with the first cities on Earth. Chapter 1, Why Mesopotamia? The Greek historian Herodotus called Egypt the gift of the Nile. He could equally have said that civilization was the gift of Mesopotamia, the gift, more precisely, of two rivers and the mud they carried. Every spring, the Tigris and Euphrates flooded. When they receded, they left behind a layer of rich, dark silt across the flat plain. In a landscape that was otherwise dry scrubland shading into desert, this silt was extraordinarily fertile. Farmers who understood the floods could grow more food than their families needed. And surplus food changed everything. But there was a problem. The floods were unpredictable and destructive unless they were managed. Controlling them, building canals, digging drainage channels, maintaining dikes, required more labor than any single family could provide. It required organization. It required cooperation at a scale no human society had yet achieved. Here is the paradox at the heart of Mesopotamian civilization: the very difficulty of living in this environment forced people to organize. An organization, at sufficient scale, produces something new. It produces a city. The flat plain of southern Mesopotamia had almost no timber, no stone, no metal. None of the raw materials that civilizations need. Yet it built the first civilization in history. The answer is grain. A surplus of grain could be traded for everything else. And those who controlled the grain controlled the world. Chapter 2, The First Cities, URUK. Around 3500 BC, something unprecedented happened at a settlement called URUK, on the banks of the Euphrates. What had been a large village became, within a few centuries, something the world had never seen: a city. By 3000 BC, URUK covered some 250 hectares and housed tens of thousands of people. Nothing remotely like it had existed before. Travelers from across the ancient Near East came to trade, to marvel, and to learn. The Epic of Gilgamesh, composed perhaps 1,000 years later, still remembered the city's walls. See how its ramparts gleam like copper in the sun. What made URUK a city rather than simply a large village? Several things. It had craft specialists, potters using the wheel, metalworkers smelting copper, weavers producing textiles for trade. It had long-distance trade networks that reached as far as the Indus Valley. It had monumental architecture, a vast mud brick platform rising above the plain, topped by the white temple of the sky god Anu. And it had something even more important. It had writing. Writing did not emerge from a poet's imagination. It emerged from an accountant's ledger. The earliest written tablets from URUK, dating to around 3200 BC, are not literature. They are lists. So many jars of oil received. So many sheep delivered to the temple. So many rations of barley issued to workers. Writing was invented to keep track of things. And in doing so, it gave humanity its memory. Chapter 3, The Invention of Writing. The path to writing was longer and stranger than we might imagine. It began not with clay tablets but with small clay tokens, spheres, cones, discs, each shape representing a different commodity. A cone for grain, a sphere for oil, a cylinder for an animal. These tokens were kept in sealed clay envelopes, and the contents pressed onto the outside. Then someone realized that the envelope was unnecessary. The impression on the outside was enough. So the tokens were abandoned, and scribes began pressing symbols directly onto flat clay tablets with a pointed reed. The first tablets, around 3200 BC, are purely practical, administrative records of the temple economy. But something extraordinary happened as scribes wrote faster. The pictograms, a drawing of a head for person, a drawing of an ox's head for cattle, became stylized. The reed stylus, pressed into wet clay, naturally produced wedge shapes. And as the symbols became more abstract, they could represent sounds as well as objects. Writing could now express anything, not just lists, but stories, laws, prayers, and eventually the oldest work of literature in the world. Learning cuneiform took years. The scribal schools, the Aduba, or tablet house, trained specialists who could read, write, calculate, and administer. Being a scribe was one of the most respected professions in ancient Mesopotamia. And it was through the scribes that everything else, law, literature, religion, administration, became possible. Chapter 4: Gods, Temples, and the Ziggurat. To understand ancient Sumer, you must understand one fundamental fact: in Sumerian theology, the land did not belong to the king. It belonged to the city's god. The temple was the god's earthly house. The priests who administered it were the god's household staff. The land around the city was the god's estate, and the farmers who worked it owed their labor and their produce to the divine landlord. This was not merely a religious idea, it was the organizational principle of the entire economy. The temple was simultaneously a place of worship, a granary, a workshop, a bank, and a system of social welfare. At the center of every Sumerian city rose the ziggurat, a stepped mud brick mountain, sometimes reaching 30 or 40 meters above the flat plain. The ziggurat was not a tomb, as the Egyptian pyramids were. It was not a place of public worship. It was a platform, raising the god's sanctuary to a height where heaven and earth could meet. On its summit, priests conducted daily rituals, feeding the god, clothing the god, washing the god, putting the god to bed. The Sumerian pantheon was elaborate and deeply human. Anu was the sky god, his temple at Uruk the most sacred site in the land. Enlil was the storm god, lord of wind and earth, whose authority legitimized the king. Inanna, later known as Ishtar, was the goddess of love and war, patron of Uruk, one of the most complex and fascinating figures in ancient religion. Enki was the god of wisdom and fresh water, the craftsman of the gods, the creator of humanity. These gods were not distant abstractions. They ate, slept, quarreled, made love, and intervened directly in human affairs. The Sumerians lived in intimate relationship with the divine, and that relationship was administered through the temple. Chapter 5: The Early Dynastic Period. Around 2900 BC, the world of Uruk gave way to something more fractious and more violent, the age of the city-states. Sumer splintered into a dozen rival cities: Ur, Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, Kish, Umma, Eridu. Each had its own god, its own king, its own walls, its own army. They traded with each other, intermarried, and fought each other constantly. A border dispute between the city-states of Lagash and Umma dragged on for generations, documented on the stelae of the vultures, one of the earliest surviving historical inscriptions, showing soldiers marching in tight formation, prisoners trapped in nets, vultures picking at the dead. Somewhere within this world, around 2700 BC, lived a historical king of Uruk named Gilgamesh. His deeds were already legendary within a century of his death. He reportedly built Uruk's great walls, claimed to be the work of a man two-thirds divine. Whether he performed the heroic feats later attributed to him is another matter. But he was real, and his fame outlasted his dynasty by 3,000 years. Around 2400 BC, a king named Lugal-Zagesi of Umma conquered most of Sumer and claimed an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. His claim lasted 25 years. Then a man from the city of Akkad ended it, and changed the world. Chapter 6, The Royal Tombs of Ur. Before we move to Akkad, we must pause at the most remarkable archaeological site in ancient Mesopotamia, the Royal Cemetery of Ur. Between 1922 and 1934, the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated a cemetery at Ur containing over 1,800 graves. Most were ordinary burials. But 16 were extraordinary, the so-called royal tombs, dated to around 2600 BC, containing objects of breathtaking beauty and deeply unsettling contents. One pit contained 74 bodies. 6 were men, 68 were women. Each woman wore elaborate headdresses of gold, lapis lazuli, and carnelian, jewelry of extraordinary workmanship. They appeared to have died willingly, having drunk poison, before being covered by earth. The most celebrated was the tomb of Queen Puabi, who was buried with her entire court. The objects found in these tombs tell us that Ur, in 2600 BC, was connected to a world of dazzling long-distance trade. The lapis lazuli came from Afghanistan, over 3,000 kilometers away. The carnelian came from India. The gold came from Anatolia. The craftsmen who made these objects achieved a level of skill that would not be surpassed for 1,000 years. Also found in the same cemetery, the Standard of Ur, a hollow wooden box covered in mosaic scenes. One side shows war, soldiers, chariots, prisoners. The other shows peace, a banquet, musicians, tribute bearers. Together they give us the clearest picture we have of life in early Sumer, its organization, its hierarchy, its beauty, and its violence. Chapter 7, The Epic of Gilgamesh. And then there is the story. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest work of literature in the world. It was composed, in different versions, over more than 1,000 years, and it remains, after nearly 5,000 years, one of the most moving stories ever told. Gilgamesh is king of Uruk, 2/3 divine, 1/3 mortal. He is magnificent and terrible, a great builder and a tyrant. The gods send him a companion, Enkidu, a wild man raised among animals, his equal in strength and his complement in spirit. Together they slay the bull of heaven and the forest demon Humbaba. They are invincible. Then Enkidu dies. And Gilgamesh, who has never considered his own mortality, is shattered. He sets out across the world to find the secret of eternal life. He reaches Utnapishtim, the one mortal granted immortality by the gods, who tells him of a great flood sent to destroy humanity, a man who built a boat, loaded it with animals, and survived. The story is written down 1,000 years before the book of Genesis. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh where to find the plant of eternal life, at the bottom of the sea. Gilgamesh dives for it. He finds it. And while he sleeps by a pool on the journey home, a serpent steals it. The oldest story in the world is about failure. About the loss of what we most desire. And about how to live anyway. The tablets of the epic were found at Nineveh in the 1850s, in the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal. When the scholar George Smith read out the flood story to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London in 1872, the audience erupted. The Prime Minister personally sent him back to dig for more. Chapter 8, Sources and Further Reading. The sources for Sumerian history are rich and varied. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature at Oxford makes virtually all surviving Sumerian literary texts available in translation online, including the full Epic of Gilgamesh, the hymns of Enheduanna, and the Great Lament poems. For the epic itself, Andrew George's translation for Penguin Classics is the gold standard, scholarly, readable, and deeply illuminating. Stephanie Daly's Myths from Mesopotamia covers the wider literary tradition. Samuel Noah Kramer's The Sumerians remains the essential introduction to the civilization as a whole. For archaeology, Leonard Woolley's excavations at Ur gives his own account of finding the royal tombs. The British Museum's collection remains the finest in the world, with objects from Ur and Nineveh on permanent display. For the broader history of the period, J.N. Postgate's Early Mesopotamia is indispensable, and Gwendolyn Light's Mesopotamia, The Invention of the City is beautifully written and accessible. End of Origins Series Part 1.